There are certain promises made in desperation that history refuses to forget. In the spring of 1848, in the cotton fields of southern Louisiana, a man named Augustus Thorne stood over another man who was dying in the dirt. The dying man spoke 7 words before his last breath left him. Augustus laughed. He laughed so hard his shoulders shook. 3 months later, Augustus Thorne was found dead in his bedroom, dressed in his wedding suit, his face frozen in an expression that made the undertaker refuse to work alone with the body. The local newspaper called it a tragic heart failure. His fiancée left Louisiana the same night and never spoke his name again. The servants who found him wouldn't enter that room for the rest of their lives. What happened in those 3 months has been buried in private letters, medical records, and testimonies that were never made public until now. Before we continue with the story of Augustus Thorne and the words that may have killed him, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you love stories that blur the line between history and horror. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Let's discover together if these dark chapters of American history happened near where you live. The events that followed that spring day would consume not just Augustus Thorne, but everyone connected to him, unraveling secrets that a prominent Louisiana family had kept hidden for generations. Bellerive Parish in southern Louisiana was not a large community in 1848, but it was prosperous. The parish sat along a bend in the Mississippi River where the water ran slow and dark, reflecting the moss-draped oak trees that lined the banks. Approximately 2,000 people lived within its boundaries, half of them enslaved, working the cotton and sugarcane plantations that made men like Augustus Thorne wealthy beyond measure. Augustus was 28 years old that spring, the only son of the late William Thorne, who had built the Thorne plantation into one of the most profitable estates in the region. Augustus had inherited everything when his father died of yellow fever in 1845. The land, the manor house with its white columns and wide verandas, the reputation and the burden of maintaining it all. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with dark hair he kept meticulously groomed and a smile that he deployed like a weapon in business negotiations. People who knew him said he had his father's charm, but lacked his father's restraint. The Thorne estate sprawled across nearly 800 acres. The main house stood at the end of a long drive lined with live oaks, a 2-story structure with tall windows that caught the morning light. Behind it stretched the fields, endless rows of cotton that turned white in late summer, and beyond those, the quarters where the enslaved workers lived in rough wooden cabins that Augustus's grandfather had built decades earlier. There were 43 people enslaved on the Thorne plantation in 1848. Augustus knew their names the way he knew his horses' names, as property, as investments, as tools that required maintenance. Among those 43 was a man named Samuel. He was 36 years old, though he looked older. Years of labor in the Louisiana heat had carved deep lines into his face and bent his back. Samuel had been born on the Thorne plantation. His mother had died when he was young, and his father had been sold away when Samuel was 12. He never saw him again. Samuel was known as a steady worker, quiet, someone who kept his head down and his thoughts to himself. He had a wife named Ruth and 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. They lived in one of the cabins closest to the fields. In the spring of 1848, Augustus Thorne was preparing for the most important event of his life, his wedding. He was engaged to Catherine Beaumont, the daughter of Judge Harold Beaumont, whose plantation bordered the Thorne estate to the north. Catherine was 23, educated in Charleston, accomplished in all the ways that mattered to Louisiana society. She played piano, spoke French, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never known want. The marriage would unite 2 of the most powerful families in Bellerive Parish. The wedding was planned for June 20th, the Saturday before the summer solstice, when the days were longest and the gardens would be in full bloom. Augustus threw himself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised even his closest friends. He ordered new furniture from New Orleans, had the manor house repainted, commissioned a dress from a seamstress in Baton Rouge for Catherine that cost more than most families earned in a year. He hired musicians from as far as Mobile, arranged for a feast that would feed 200 guests, and had a gazebo built in the garden specifically for the ceremony. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to demonstrate that Augustus Thorne was not just wealthy. He was a man of vision, a man who would shape the future of Bellerive Parish. But perfection required control, and control required discipline. Augustus ran his plantation the way his father had taught him, with an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove for those who obeyed, and naked iron for those who didn't. He believed that enslaved people needed to understand their place, that any sign of defiance or laziness had to be crushed immediately, or it would spread like disease through the quarters. Samuel understood this. He had lived his entire life under this system. He knew when to lower his eyes, when to say yes, sir, when to move quickly, and when to disappear. He had survived by being invisible, by making himself into exactly what was expected of him. But in the spring of 1848, something changed. It started with Samuel's daughter. Her name was Grace, and she had fallen ill in late March. At first it seemed like a common fever, the kind that passed through the quarters every spring when the weather turned warm and wet. But Grace's fever didn't break. It climbed higher. She stopped eating. Her skin burned to the touch, and she began to have seizures that left her weak and confused. Ruth begged the overseer, a man named Dalton, to send for a doctor. Dalton said he would ask Mr. Thorne. Augustus refused. He said doctors were expensive, and it was probably just swamp fever that would pass on its own. He told Dalton to give Ruth some willow bark tea and keep the girl in the cabin until she recovered. Samuel came to the main house himself, hat in hand, and asked Augustus directly. He explained that Grace was getting worse, that she needed help, that he would work extra hours, anything, if Mr. Thorne would just send for the doctor. Augustus looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then he said, "Your girl will be fine. Children get sick. They get better. Now get back to work before I have Dalton remind you what happens to people who waste my time." Samuel went back to work. Grace died 4 days later, on April 3rd, 1848. She died in her mother's arms, her small body racked with convulsions, her fever so high that Ruth said her daughter's skin felt like touching a stove. The cause was likely scarlet fever, though no doctor ever examined her to confirm it. Samuel and Ruth buried their daughter in the small plot behind the quarters where other enslaved people were laid to rest, marked only with wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years. Samuel didn't speak for 3 days after Grace died. He went to the fields, did his work, and returned to his cabin in silence. Ruth was terrified, not of Samuel's grief, but of what it might make him do. She knew that grief could turn into anger, and anger could get a man killed. She begged him to hold on, to think of their son, to survive. Samuel nodded, but his eyes had changed. Something in them had gone dark and cold. The incident that led to that spring day happened on April 18th, 15 days after Grace's death. Augustus was inspecting the fields with Dalton, discussing the planting schedule and the expected yield for the season. He was in high spirits. Catherine had just sent word that her dress had arrived from Baton Rouge, and the invitations to the wedding had been printed and were being distributed to families across 3 parishes. Augustus was imagining his wedding day, the admiration of his guests, the beginning of his new life as a married man and a patriarch. They came upon Samuel working in the far field, near the tree line, where the cultivated land gave way to swamp. Samuel was moving slowly, his movements mechanical, his face blank. Dalton noticed first. He called out to Samuel, told him to pick up the pace. Samuel didn't respond. Dalton walked over, repeated the command. Samuel looked up at him, and for just a moment there was something in his eyes, a flash of defiance, of rage, of something that refused to be invisible anymore. Dalton struck him across the face with the back of his hand. It was a casual blow, the kind of violence so routine on plantations that it barely registered as an event. But Samuel didn't lower his eyes. He stared at Dalton, and then his gaze shifted to Augustus, who was watching from a few feet away. "My daughter died," Samuel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the field. "She died because you wouldn't help her." The words hung in the air. Dalton's face went red. Augustus's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. This was the kind of moment that could not be ignored. If Samuel was allowed to speak this way, to challenge a white man, to blame his master for anything, it would undermine everything. Other enslaved people were working nearby. They had heard. This had to be dealt with immediately and decisively. "Your daughter died because God willed it," Augustus said, his voice calm and cold. "And if you ever speak to me that way again, you'll join her." Samuel took a step forward. It was a small step, barely a movement, but it was enough. Dalton grabbed him, and two other overseers who had been working nearby came running. They forced Samuel to the ground. Augustus watched, his arms crossed, as they bound Samuel's hands behind his back. What happened next was not unusual for the time and place. Samuel was punished. The punishment was severe, brutal enough to serve as an example, to remind everyone in the quarters what happened when you forgot your place. The details are not necessary to recount here, but the result was clear. Samuel was left broken, bleeding, and barely conscious in the dirt of the field where he had been working. Augustus stood over him as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The other enslaved workers had been ordered back to their tasks, but Augustus knew they were watching from the corners of their eyes. He needed to say something, to make this moment a lesson that would be remembered. "You brought this on yourself," Augustus said, looking down at Samuel. "You forgot what you are. Let this remind you." Samuel's eyes opened. They were unfocused, glazed with pain, but they found Augustus's face. His lips moved. At first, no sound came out. Then, with effort that seemed to cost him everything he had left, Samuel spoke. His voice was a rasp, barely audible, but Augustus heard every word. "You will not see your wedding day." 7 words, simple, direct, a statement, not a threat. Not a curse in the supernatural sense, but a prediction, a promise, a final act of defiance from a man who had nothing left to lose. Augustus stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed. It started as a chuckle, then grew into full, genuine laughter. He laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. The absurdity of it, this broken man in the dirt making threats as if he had any power at all. It was ridiculous. It was pathetic. "You hear that, Dalton?" Augustus called out, still laughing. "He says I won't see my wedding day, as if he has any say in the matter, as if God listens to the prayers of people like him." Dalton forced a laugh, though it sounded uncertain. Augustus turned and walked away, still chuckling, shaking his head at the foolishness of it all. Samuel died that night. His body gave out from the injuries, from the heat, from the accumulated weight of 36 years of bondage. Ruth found him in the cabin when she returned from the main house, where she worked in the kitchen. He was lying on the rough wooden floor, his eyes open, his hand reaching toward the corner where Grace's small bed had been. Ruth didn't cry. She had no tears left. She closed Samuel's eyes, covered his body with a blanket, and sat with him until morning. When Dalton came to check on him, she told him Samuel was dead. Dalton nodded, made a note in his ledger, 1 less worker, a financial loss for Mr. Thorne, and arranged for the body to be buried next to Grace. Augustus was informed of Samuel's death while he was having breakfast. He nodded, expressed mild annoyance at the inconvenience, and went back to reading a letter from Catherine about the final arrangements for their wedding. He didn't think about Samuel again. Why would he? The man was gone. The incident was over. Life continued. But 3 days later, on April 21st, Augustus woke in the middle of the night with a pain in his chest. It felt like someone had placed a hot iron against his sternum. He sat up in bed, gasping, his hand pressed against his chest. The pain lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded. Augustus lay back down, his heart racing, and told himself it was nothing. Indigestion from the rich meal he'd eaten that evening, stress from the wedding preparations, the heat. He didn't mention it to anyone. But it happened again, 2 nights later, and again, and again. The first time Augustus saw Samuel, he convinced himself it was a dream. It was April 27th, 9 days after Samuel's death. Augustus had been working in his study, going over the accounts for the plantation. The room was on the 2nd floor of the manor house with windows that overlooked the front drive and the oak trees beyond. It was late, past midnight. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of frogs singing in the swamp. Augustus had been experiencing the chest pains almost nightly now. They came without warning, sharp and intense, leaving him breathless and sweating. He had started keeping a bottle of whiskey in his study, and he would drink a glass when the pain came, telling himself it helped. That night, he had just poured his 2nd glass when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his study. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind that suggested someone walking with difficulty, dragging one foot slightly. Augustus looked up from his papers. The house should have been empty except for the servants sleeping in their quarters behind the main house. He stood, walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was dark. The single candle he had left burning on the hall table had gone out, though there was no draught. Augustus stepped into the hallway, holding his own candle high. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. But at the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, he saw a shadow. It was the shape of a man, standing motionless, facing him. I said, "Who's there?" Augustus's voice was sharper now, edged with irritation and something else, something he wouldn't admit was fear. The shadow didn't move. Augustus walked toward it, his candle casting flickering light on the walls. As he got closer, the shadow seemed to recede, backing toward the stairs. Augustus quickened his pace, anger rising in his chest. If one of the servants had entered the house without permission, there would be consequences. He reached the top of the stairs. The shadow was gone. Augustus stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding. He looked down the staircase into the darkened foyer below. Nothing. No movement, no sound. He went back to his study, locked the door, and finished the bottle of whiskey. When he finally fell asleep in his chair, he dreamed of the field, of Samuel lying in the dirt, of those 7 words spoken in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. The next morning, Augustus told himself it had been the whiskey, the stress, his imagination. He threw himself into the wedding preparations with renewed energy, as if staying busy could keep the shadows at bay. But the incidents continued. On May 2nd, Augustus was riding his horse along the property line, inspecting the fences. It was mid-afternoon, the sun high and hot. He had just dismounted to examine a section of fence that needed repair, when his horse suddenly reared, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring. Augustus grabbed the reins, trying to calm the animal, but the horse was terrified of something. It pulled away from him, nearly trampling him, and bolted back toward the stables. Augustus stood alone on the empty road. He looked around, trying to see what had spooked the horse. The fields stretched out on either side of him, the cotton plants still small and green. The tree line was about 50 yards away, a dark wall of cypress and oak draped with Spanish moss. And standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a man, watching him. Augustus's breath caught. He took a step forward, squinting against the sun. The figure didn't move. Augustus called out, "You there, come here." The figure turned and walked into the trees, disappearing into the darkness beneath the canopy. Augustus ran after it. He crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at his face, his boots sinking into the soft ground. He ran for perhaps 2 minutes, his lungs burning until he burst into a small clearing. Empty. No one there. Just trees and swamp water and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He walked back to the road slowly, his clothes torn, his hands scratched and bleeding from the branches. When he reached the stables, his horse was there, still trembling, foam on its mouth. The stable hand looked at Augustus with concern and asked if he was all right. "Fine," Augustus said. "The horse spooked, that's all." But he wasn't fine. That night, the chest pains came back worse than ever. And when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of Samuel's face, of his eyes staring up from the dirt, of his lips moving to form those 7 words over and over again. The servants began to notice changes in Augustus. He was irritable, snapping at them over minor mistakes. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He started drinking more, not just at night, but during the day. He would stand at the windows of the manor house for long periods, staring out at the fields, his expression distant and troubled. Catherine noticed too. She came to visit on May 10th, 3 weeks after Samuel's death, to discuss the final details of the wedding. She found Augustus in the parlor, unshaven, his clothes rumpled, a glass of whiskey in his hand even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. "Augustus, are you ill?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "No," he said quickly. "Just tired. The preparations, you know. There's so much to manage." Catherine sat beside him, took his hand. "You look exhausted. Perhaps you should see Dr. Whitfield. He could give you something to help you sleep." Augustus pulled his hand away. "I don't need a doctor, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine, and Catherine could see it. She left that afternoon feeling uneasy, though she couldn't quite articulate why. There was something in Augustus's eyes, a haunted quality, a fear that he was trying desperately to hide. That night, May 10th, Augustus woke to find someone standing at the foot of his bed. The room was dark, but there was enough moonlight coming through the window for him to see the silhouette. A man, tall, thin, his posture bent as if in pain, standing perfectly still, watching him. Augustus's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He lay there, frozen, staring at the figure. And then the figure spoke. The voice was soft, hoarse, but unmistakable. "You will not see your wedding day." Augustus screamed. He lunged out of bed, grabbing the candlestick from his nightstand, and swung it at the figure. The candlestick passed through empty air. The figure was gone. Augustus stood in his bedroom alone, gasping, the candlestick clutched in his shaking hand. He lit every candle in the room. He checked the door, locked from the inside. He checked the windows, closed and latched. There was no way anyone could have entered. No way anyone could have left. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in a chair by the window, the candlestick in his lap, watching the door, waiting for dawn. Augustus didn't tell anyone what he had seen. How could he? If he admitted that he was seeing things, hearing voices, people would think he was losing his mind. And if word got out that Augustus Thorne was unstable, it could ruin everything. The wedding, his reputation, his business relationships. So he kept silent and tried to convince himself that it was stress, exhaustion, perhaps some illness that would pass. But the incidents didn't stop. They escalated. On May 14th, Augustus was having dinner with Judge Beaumont and Catherine at the Beaumont estate. It was meant to be a pleasant evening, a final gathering before the wedding. The conversation was light, talk of the weather, the cotton crop, mutual acquaintances. Augustus tried to focus, tried to be charming and engaged, but he kept losing track of the conversation. His mind would wander, and he would find himself staring at nothing, his fork halfway to his mouth, until Catherine would gently touch his arm and bring him back. At one point during the meal, Augustus looked up and saw Samuel standing in the corner of the dining room. He was wearing the same clothes he had died in, stained and torn. His face was bruised, his eyes fixed on Augustus. No one else seemed to notice him. Judge Beaumont was talking about the upcoming harvest. Catherine was laughing at something her father had said. And Samuel stood there, silent, watching. Augustus dropped his fork. It clattered against his plate, and everyone looked at him. "Are you all right, son?" Judge Beaumont asked. Augustus looked back at the corner. Empty. Samuel was gone. "Yes," Augustus said, his voice strained. "I'm sorry. I thought I saw. It's nothing, I'm fine." But Catherine's eyes were worried. After dinner, she pulled him aside in the garden. "Augustus, please tell me what's wrong," she said. "You're not yourself. You haven't been for weeks." Augustus wanted to tell her. He wanted to confess everything, The chest pains, the shadows, the voice in his bedroom, but he couldn't. If he told her, she might call off the wedding. Her father might decide that Augustus was unfit, unstable, a bad match for his daughter. "I'm just tired," he said, forcing a smile. "Once the wedding is over and we're settled, everything will be better. I promise." Catherine didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "All right, but please take care of yourself. I need you to be well." Augustus kissed her hand and left. On the ride back to his estate, he saw Samuel 3 more times, once standing by the side of the road, once in the window of a cabin as he passed the quarters, and once in the reflection of a puddle, staring up at him from the water. By the time Augustus reached the manor house, he was shaking so badly he could barely dismount his horse. The servants had begun to talk among themselves. They noticed that Mr. Thorne looked ill, that he barely ate, that he would sometimes stop in the middle of giving an order and stare at nothing, his face pale. Some of them whispered that he was being haunted, that Samuel's spirit had come back for revenge. Others said it was guilt, that Mr. Thorne's conscience was finally catching up with him. Ruth heard the whispers. She said nothing, but there was a grim satisfaction in her eyes. She had not forgiven Augustus for letting Grace die, for killing Samuel. If he was suffering now, she thought, it was no more than he deserved. On May 18th, 1 month after Samuel's death, Augustus went to see Dr. Whitfield. He didn't want to, but the chest pains had become unbearable, and he was barely sleeping. He needed help, even if it meant admitting weakness. Dr. Whitfield was a portly man in his 50s, with a kind face and a calm demeanor. He examined Augustus thoroughly, listened to his heart, checked his pulse, asked about his symptoms. When he was finished, he sat back and regarded Augustus with a thoughtful expression. "Your heart sounds strong," Dr. Whitfield said. "Your pulse is elevated, but that could be due to stress. Tell me, have you been under unusual strain lately?" Augustus almost laughed. Unusual strain. That was one way to put it. "The wedding," Augustus said. "There's a lot to manage." Dr. Whitfield nodded. "Wedding preparations can be stressful, certainly, but I suspect there's more to it than that. You look exhausted, Augustus. When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" Augustus couldn't remember. "It's been difficult," he admitted. "Are you experiencing any other symptoms? Anxiety, disturbing thoughts?" Augustus hesitated. This was the moment. He could tell Dr. Whitfield everything, the visions, the voice, the figure in his bedroom. But what would the doctor think? What would he do? "No," Augustus said finally. "Just the chest pains and the insomnia." Dr. Whitfield prescribed laudanum to help him sleep and advised him to rest, to avoid excessive work and worry. Augustus took the prescription and left, knowing that rest was impossible. How could he rest when every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's face? That night, Augustus took a dose of laudanum and went to bed early. The drug pulled him down into a heavy, dreamless sleep. But at some point in the night, he woke, or thought he woke. The room was dark and he couldn't move. His body felt paralyzed, pinned to the bed by an invisible weight. And standing beside the bed, leaning over him, was Samuel. Samuel's face was inches from his own. Augustus could see every detail, the bruises, the cuts, the dried blood. Samuel's eyes were open, staring into his, and his lips moved, whispering the same 7 words over and over again. "You will not see your wedding day. You will not see your wedding day. You will not see your wedding day." Augustus tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He lay there, helpless, as Samuel's whisper filled his ears, filled his mind, until it was the only thing he could hear. And then suddenly, he could move again. He bolted upright, gasping, his body drenched in sweat. The room was empty. Samuel was gone. But the whisper lingered in his mind, echoing, refusing to fade. Augustus didn't sleep again that night, or the next, or the next. By late May, Augustus Thorne was a shadow of the man he had been 2 months earlier. He had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He moved through the manor house like a ghost himself, jumping at every sound, staring at every shadow. The wedding was now less than 3 weeks away. The preparations were nearly complete. The food ordered, the musicians hired, the guests confirmed. Everything was ready. But Augustus was falling apart. Catherine came to visit on May 24th and was shocked by his appearance. She insisted that he see Dr. Whitfield again, but Augustus refused. He knew the doctor couldn't help him. This wasn't a medical problem. This was something else, something that medicine couldn't cure. "Augustus, please," Catherine begged. "You're frightening me. What's happening to you?" Augustus looked at her, and for a moment he almost told her everything. But then he imagined her reaction. The horror, the disbelief, the inevitable conclusion that he was insane. He couldn't bear it. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was hollow. "Just a few more weeks and everything will be perfect. You'll see." But Catherine wasn't convinced. That evening she spoke with her father, expressing her concerns. Judge Beaumont was troubled. He had noticed Augustus's decline as well, and he was beginning to wonder if the marriage should be postponed. But the invitations had been sent, the arrangements made. Calling off the wedding now would be a scandal, an embarrassment to both families. "Give him a little more time," Judge Beaumont said. "Perhaps he'll recover once the wedding is over and the pressure is off." Catherine reluctantly agreed, though her unease only grew. Meanwhile, strange things were happening at the Thorne estate. Servants reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own, cold spots in the house even on warm nights. One of the kitchen maids swore she saw a figure standing in the garden at dawn, watching the house. But when she looked again, it was gone. Ruth, working in the kitchen, heard these stories and said nothing. But she knew. She knew that Samuel had not left. She could feel his presence, a cold anger that permeated the house like smoke. She wondered if Augustus could feel it too, if that was why he looked so haunted. On May 28th, Augustus received a letter. It was delivered by a rider from New Orleans, a sealed envelope with no return address. Augustus opened it in his study, his hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in a careful, deliberate hand, were 7 words: "You will not see your wedding day." Augustus stared at the letter, his heart pounding. Who had sent this? Who knew about Samuel's words? He turned the envelope over, looking for any clue. But there was nothing. No signature, no indication of who had written it. He crumpled the letter and threw it into the fireplace, watching it burn, but the words were already burned into his mind. He couldn't escape them. That night, Augustus didn't even try to sleep. He sat in his study with every candle lit, a pistol on the desk in front of him. He didn't know what he was defending himself against, but he felt safer with the weapon nearby. At some point past midnight, he heard the footsteps again. Slow, dragging, coming down the hallway toward his study. Augustus grabbed the pistol, his hands slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped outside his door. "Who's there?" Augustus called out, his voice cracking. No answer, just silence. Augustus stood, walked to the door and yanked it open, the pistol raised. The hallway was empty. But on the floor, directly in front of his door, was a small wooden cross, the kind that marked the graves in the burial plot behind the quarters. Augustus stared at it, his breath coming in short gasps. He picked it up with trembling hands. It was rough, hand-carved, the kind of marker that would rot away in a few years, leaving no trace that anyone had ever been buried there. He threw the cross down the hallway and slammed the door, locking it. He backed away, the pistol still in his hand, and sank into his chair. He was losing his mind. He had to be. There was no other explanation. Samuel was dead. Dead people didn't walk, didn't leave crosses, didn't whisper in the dark. But if he was losing his mind, why did it feel so real? The first week of June brought oppressive heat to Bellerive Parish. The air was thick and humid, pressing down like a wet blanket. Thunderstorms rolled through every afternoon, violent and brief, leaving the ground steaming and the air even heavier than before. Augustus barely noticed the weather. He was trapped in his own private hell, a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. The visions of Samuel came almost constantly now, in mirrors, in windows, in the shadows of trees. Sometimes Samuel just stood there, watching. Other times, he would mouth those 7 words, his lips moving silently, the message clear. Augustus stopped going to the fields. He stopped meeting with his overseers. He locked himself in the manor house, moving from room to room, never staying in one place for long, as if he could outrun the ghost that followed him. The servants were terrified. They whispered that the house was cursed, that Mr. Thorne had done something terrible and was being punished for it. Some of them asked to be reassigned to work in the fields, anywhere but the main house. Dalton, the overseer, tried to maintain order, but even he was unnerved by Augustus's behavior. On June 8th, 12 days before the wedding, Catherine came to the estate unannounced. She found Augustus in the parlor, sitting in the dark, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. "Augustus, this has to stop," she said, her voice firm. "You're destroying yourself. Whatever is wrong, you need to tell me. We're supposed to be married in less than 2 weeks, and I don't even recognize you anymore." Augustus looked at her, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. And something inside him broke. "I'm being haunted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine stared at him. "What?" "Samuel, the man who died. He's haunting me. I see him everywhere. I hear his voice. He told me I wouldn't see my wedding day, and I think he was right." Catherine's face went pale. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped in her lap. "Augustus, that's not possible. You're ill. You need help." "I'm not ill," Augustus said, his voice rising. "I know what I've seen. I know what I've heard. He's here, Catherine. He's in this house. He's waiting for me." Catherine stood abruptly. "I'm sending for Dr. Whitfield, and I'm going to speak with my father. We need to postpone the wedding until you're well." "No," Augustus grabbed her arm. "We can't postpone. If we postpone, people will talk. They'll say I'm weak, that I'm mad. I can't let that happen." Catherine pulled her arm free, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't care what people say. I care about you, and right now you need help more than you need a wedding." She left, and Augustus didn't try to stop her. He sat back down, picked up the whiskey bottle, and drank until the room spun. Dr. Whitfield arrived the next morning, accompanied by Judge Beaumont. They found Augustus in his bedroom, disheveled and incoherent, muttering about shadows and voices. Dr. Whitfield examined him and concluded that Augustus was suffering from severe nervous exhaustion, possibly exacerbated by excessive alcohol consumption. "He needs rest," Dr. Whitfield said, "complete rest away from any stress or responsibility. I recommend postponing the wedding and having him stay with family or friends where he can recover." Judge Beaumont nodded grimly. "I'll speak with Catherine. We'll make the arrangements." But Augustus, overhearing this, became agitated. "No," he said, his voice hoarse but insistent. "The wedding will happen. It has to happen. I won't let him win." "Let who win?" Judge Beaumont asked. Augustus didn't answer. He turned away, staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. Dr. Whitfield increased the laudanum dosage and left instructions for Augustus to be monitored closely. Judge Beaumont and Catherine agreed to postpone any final decision about the wedding for a few more days, hoping that Augustus would improve. But Augustus didn't improve. If anything, he got worse. On June 12th, one of the servants found Augustus in the garden at dawn, digging in the flower beds with his bare hands. His fingers were bloody, his clothes covered in dirt. When the servant asked what he was doing, Augustus said he was looking for the cross, that he had to find it and destroy it, that it was the only way to make Samuel leave. The servant helped Augustus back to the house and informed Dalton, who in turn sent word to Dr. Whitfield. The doctor came again, sedated Augustus, and had a long, serious conversation with Judge Beaumont. "I believe Augustus is experiencing a complete nervous breakdown," Dr. Whitfield said. "He's not in his right mind. He needs to be institutionalized, at least temporarily, until he can recover." Judge Beaumont was horrified. Institutionalization would be a scandal, a permanent stain on the Thorne family name. But he also recognized that Augustus was a danger to himself. "Let me speak with Catherine," Judge Beaumont said. "We'll decide what to do." That evening, Catherine came to see Augustus one last time. He was in his bedroom, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. She sat beside him and took his hand. "Augustus, I love you," she said softly, "but I can't marry you like this. Not when you're suffering so much. We're going to postpone the wedding. You're going to get help. And when you're well, we'll try again." Augustus turned his head to look at her. His eyes were hollow, empty. "He was right," Augustus whispered. "I won't see my wedding day." Catherine's tears fell freely now. "Don't say that. You're going to be fine. You just need time." But Augustus shook his head slowly. "It's too late. He's already won." Catherine left, her heart breaking. She told her father that the wedding had to be called off, that Augustus needed serious medical intervention. Judge Beaumont agreed and began making arrangements to send Augustus to an asylum in New Orleans. But they were too late. On the morning of June 19th, the day before what was supposed to be Augustus Thorne's wedding, the household woke to an eerie silence. The servants, accustomed to hearing Augustus moving about at odd hours, noticed that the manor house was completely quiet. Ruth, arriving early to begin preparations in the kitchen, felt a chill run down her spine. The air in the house felt wrong, cold and heavy, despite the summer heat outside. She went about her work, but her hands were shaking. At around 8 o'clock, Dalton arrived at the main house to check on Augustus. He had been instructed by Dr. Whitfield to monitor him closely, especially after the incident in the garden. Dalton knocked on Augustus's bedroom door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Dalton tried the handle. The door was locked from the inside. He called out Augustus's name. Silence. A sense of dread settled over Dalton. He went to fetch one of the other servants, and together they broke down the door. The sight that greeted them would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Augustus Thorne was lying on his bed, dressed in his wedding suit. The suit was immaculate: black coat, white shirt, silk cravat, polished shoes. His hands were folded on his chest, as if he had arranged himself carefully. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. But it was his face that made Dalton step back, his hand over his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. Augustus's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes wide, the whites showing all around the irises. His skin was pale, almost grey, and there were deep scratches on his neck, as if he had clawed at himself in his final moments. Dalton approached slowly, his heart pounding. He reached out and touched Augustus's hand. Cold, stiff. Augustus Thorne was dead. The servant who had accompanied Dalton ran from the room, shouting for help. Within minutes, the entire household was in chaos. Dr. Whitfield was summoned immediately. Judge Beaumont and Catherine were notified. The news spread through the parish like wildfire. Dr. Whitfield arrived within the hour. He examined Augustus's body carefully, checking for any signs of violence or poisoning. He found none. Augustus's heart had simply stopped. The official cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Whitfield, was cardiac failure, likely brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion. But Dr. Whitfield couldn't explain the expression on Augustus's face. He had seen many dead bodies in his career, but he had never seen anything like this. It was as if Augustus had died in the grip of unimaginable fear, as if he had seen something in his final moments that had literally frightened him to death. The undertaker, a man named Mr. Finch, was called to prepare the body. But when Mr. Finch arrived and saw Augustus's face, he refused to work alone. He insisted that 2 of his assistants stay with him in the room, and even then, he worked as quickly as possible, his hands trembling. "I've never seen anything like it," Mr. Finch said later to his wife. "It was like he died looking at the devil himself." Catherine was devastated. She had loved Augustus despite everything, and his death felt like a cruel twist of fate. She couldn't bring herself to view the body. Judge Beaumont did, and he emerged from the room pale and shaken, refusing to speak about what he had seen. The funeral was held 2 days later on June 21st, the day after what would have been the wedding. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same guests who had been invited to celebrate Augustus's marriage now attended his burial. The same flowers that had been ordered for the wedding decorated his coffin. Augustus was buried in the family plot on the Thorne estate next to his father. The service was brief. Few people spoke. There was a sense of unease, a feeling that something unnatural had occurred, though no one wanted to say it out loud. Ruth attended the funeral, standing at the back with the other servants. She watched as they lowered Augustus's coffin into the ground, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no sorrow, just emptiness. After the funeral, Catherine left Louisiana. She couldn't stay in Bellerive Parish, couldn't bear the memories. She moved to Charleston to live with relatives, and she never married. For the rest of her life, she refused to speak about Augustus Thorne or what had happened to him. Judge Beaumont quietly arranged for the Thorne estate to be sold. The new owners were a family from Georgia who knew nothing of the estate's history. They moved into the manor house in the fall of 1848, full of optimism and plans for the future. But they didn't stay long. Within 6 months, they reported strange occurrences: footsteps in empty rooms, doors that wouldn't stay closed, cold spots that appeared without explanation. The wife claimed she saw a figure standing in the garden at night watching the house. The husband dismissed it as imagination, but even he couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the place. They sold the estate in 1849 and moved back to Georgia. The Thorne Manor House changed hands several more times over the next 2 decades, but no one stayed for long. By the 1870s, it had been abandoned, left to decay slowly under the Louisiana sun. The story of Augustus Thorne and his mysterious death became a local legend in Bellerive Parish. People whispered about it in taverns and parlors, each retelling adding new details, new interpretations. Some said it was divine punishment for his cruelty. Others said it was simply the tragic result of a man who worked himself to death. A few, usually late at night and in hushed voices, suggested that Samuel's curse had been real, that some promises made in desperation carry a power that transcends death. The truth, as is often the case, is impossible to know with certainty. The medical evidence pointed to heart failure brought on by stress. Augustus had been under immense pressure, had barely slept or eaten in weeks, had consumed excessive amounts of alcohol and laudanum. It's entirely plausible that his body simply gave out, that his heart stopped under the accumulated strain. But the timing is difficult to ignore. Samuel had said Augustus would not see his wedding day, and Augustus died the day before his wedding, dressed in his wedding suit, as if preparing for a ceremony he would never attend. Was it coincidence, self-fulfilling prophecy, or something else? Dr. Whitfield, in his private journal, wrote about the case years later. He noted that he had never seen a patient deteriorate so rapidly from nervous exhaustion, and he admitted that he couldn't fully explain Augustus's symptoms or his death. There are aspects of the human mind and body that remain mysteries to medical science, he wrote. Perhaps Augustus Thorne's guilt manifested in physical symptoms that ultimately killed him. Or perhaps there are forces in this world that we do not yet understand. Ruth lived for another 30 years after Samuel's death. She eventually gained her freedom after the Civil War and moved to New Orleans, where she worked as a seamstress. She rarely spoke about her time on the Thorne plantation, but in her final years, a neighbor asked her if she believed Samuel's words had killed Augustus Thorne. Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I believe that some debts must be paid one way or another. Whether it was Samuel's spirit or Augustus's own conscience that killed him, I cannot say. But he died as Samuel said he would, and perhaps that's justice enough." The Thorne Manor House stood empty for decades, slowly crumbling into ruin. The fields were eventually absorbed by neighboring plantations. The quarters where Samuel and Ruth and Grace had lived were torn down, the wood used for other buildings, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. But the story persisted. In the 1920s, a historian researching plantation life in Louisiana came across references to the Thorn case in old parish records and private letters. He tried to investigate further, but found that many of the relevant documents had been lost or destroyed. What remained were fragments, a death certificate, a few letters from Catherine to her family, Dr. Whitfield's journal entries, and the testimony of descendants of people who had been there. The historian published a brief article about the case in a regional history journal, noting the unusual circumstances and the persistent local legends. He concluded that while the supernatural elements were almost certainly folklore, the psychological aspects of the case were fascinating and worthy of further study. Today, the site where the Thorn Manor House once stood is an empty field, overgrown with weeds and small trees. There's no marker, no sign that anything significant ever happened there. The burial plot where Samuel and Grace were laid to rest has long since been lost. The wooden crosses rotted away, the exact location forgotten. But on certain nights, locals say, if you stand in that field when the moon is full and the air is still, you can hear footsteps in the grass. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if someone is walking with great difficulty. And if you're brave enough to stay and listen, you might hear a voice, soft and hoarse, repeating 7 words over and over again. You will not see your wedding day. Is it the wind, the settling of the earth, the power of suggestion acting on an imagination primed by old stories? Or is it something else? Something that refuses to be forgotten, a promise that echoes across the years? The answer, like so much about this story, depends on what you choose to believe. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Augustus Thorn died from guilt and stress? Or was there something more at work? Do you think Samuel's words carried a power beyond the natural world, or was it all coincidence and psychology? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American history, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between history and horror. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, more secrets buried in the past, waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video.